Welcome to Trial by Wine. We take a closer look at crimes that highlight how fascinating humans can be. Schmitty, Swanny and Clarkey visit crimes and run them through their jury of three, debating both sides of the case to agree an appropriate, if totally fictitious, sentence. Please be advised, Trial by Wine may include explicit or disturbing content and will include drunken rambling. Listener discretion is advised. All right, how are we?
Not too bad. How are you guys?
Going well.
I'm really good.
Boys, how are you?
What can I tell you?
You've been posting some nice pictures of outside looking very wintry and nice sky and the dogs and the land.
Although Pino's plotting to kill them, apparently.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, that's our joke with our dog. So because we don't have kids, and you have people
inherit it all.
Your dog is your kid. Yeah, she's gonna.
One that is long line.
So when we get too cheeky, she goes, well, when you lot are gone, I'm going to have this whole farm and I'm going to have all my puppy friends over and we're going to rock. What about you?
I have been very busy doing lots and lots of things with my children. They've had a very busy term where a lot of them, or two of them, have been living on campus, and I'll sort of go into it a little bit later. But there's been mother and son and father and son, and basically it's 6 weekends in a row for my husband and I of doing stuff with the school. So we're down to our last weekend this weekend, and then we're out at the side. But it's been a bit of a commitment. But yeah, everything just busy with kids, really. Yawn. Sorry, everybody. If you could cut that whole thing out, no one would care. I'd be already asleep.
Oh, that's all right.
Hilarious.
What are yours?
That's what makes us interesting, is that we have quite different backgrounds and different things that we focus on.
Is that
we're
one of
quite
us is not?
representative,
Yes, I
though.
understand that.
Yeah. Well, of a subgroup of people.
Yes.
That's why our listener numbers are so high.
Oh,
That'll
massive. We resonate with so many people. That's right. Yeah. Anyway, shall we introduce ourselves? I'm Schmitty.
I'm Swanny.
And I'm Clarkey. And together we are Trial by Wine. It's just occurred to me, I'm learning Italian on Duolingo.
Oh.
And I need to work out how to say trial by wine in Italian. And maybe one day we can do the introduction in Italian.
Coglione pipa?
In Italian, sure. I don't think it's coglione pipa.
No.
We believe, and we're not entirely sure, but that apparently means boring wanker.
Wanker. We needed to.
Yeah, right.
We needed to call someone a boring wanker whilst we were in Rome once on a night out, and that's the best we could come up with a
We
translation.
needed to.
But for some reason it stuck, and what are we now? Nearly 20 years later, and we're still talking about coglione pipa.
Oddly, I'm not up to that Duolingo module yet, so I can't confirm or deny. But
I think
I'll
it's
get
about
there.
Prova del vino. Prova del vino.
Oh,
Ladies and gentlemen.
What is it?
Prova del vino.
Prova del Vino.
Prova del vino.
Mm.
Si.
proof and
There you
wine,
go.
sort of thing.
I suppose so, yeah.
There you
I was
go.
looking at-
Yeah, okay.
Mm.
Mm.
Are you sure it's not already
Although-
translated into Italian? Because I'm sure
Although
it's for
the
the
Collins
many.
Dictionary, the Collins Dictionary says it's trial by jury is processo penale con giria.
Yeah, that makes more
So
sense.
Yeah.
processo,
Processo
penale,
penale con vino.
con vino, del vino, because it's by wine.
Oh, yes, sorry, del
Not
vino,
of
not
wine.
with wine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Or with, yes. Right. Anyway, it
Good
doesn't
chat.
sound as good. I prefer Provo del vino. Anyway. And what are we drinking? What is the vino we're enjoying today? Or
Wow.
alcohol derivative? Swanny's on
If everyone could
You
just
can
see
see
that little video that
Coke
Swanny's
Zero.
doing.
It's my first of the day, actually, and I need it.
Okay. Coke Zero.
Coke Zero.
Boys?
Oh,
We're continuing the theme of alcohol-free wines, which is very strange for us. But we're having
It's all night.
what's called a plus and minus Pinot Noir 2022. So it looks like this.
oh, nice packaging.
Yeah, it's a first choice job. It's $15 a bottle, which I understand that they're probably short batches and it's all very experimental. But I thought one of the reasons alcohol had the price tag it had was because of tax. And so
No, I tell you, non-alcoholic wine is just
Is
as
that
expensive
right?
as alcoholic wine. Yep.
to make
Yeah.
or just
To buy.
yeah, I know. That's what I understand. But I'm wondering about the gouging
Correct. So I think it is a bit of a gouge. And it's interesting because I bought, which I haven't drunk, I've still got them in my liquor cabinet. I went through a phase of trying non-alcoholic spirits like
Yep.
rum and stuff like that,
Yeah.
which
Yep.
tastes more like caramel water, I'd say.
Oh,
Yeah,
yum.
right.
It wasn't really rummy, but it was all right. I suppose if you had it in a fruity cocktail, then you might be able to
Yeah.
just about pass
Yeah.
it. But if it's just with Coke or something, it doesn't really work. But yeah, they cost the same as buying a bottle of rum. So I've gone to buying a bottle of rum. I'd rather.
So you could actually
have the
get
alcohol version.
alcoholic wine cheaper. So anyway, this is
Yes,
it's a
you
Pinot
can.
Noir.
Three
It's
buck chuck.
actually quite drinkable.
Mhm.
I guess it's kind of like wine, but without all the fun.
Yes. Well, I think non-alcoholic wine is like wine, but without all the fun.
What about yourself, Dal?
Well, as we know, it is a school night, and that means nothing to me. So I am drinking a vodka cruiser of my old mango chutney, friends. Yeah.
Mango.
Nice.
Still that same slab that I topped up on ages and ages ago. I'm still going
Yeah,
through.
right.
I only drink it for our recordings now.
Looks like that first one's not going to spend too much more time on this earth. Had a
No, well,
few
I'm
good
about halfway
swigs
through
already.
already.
Well played.
I was a bit thirsty and I've just come in from work. All right, so who's got a story for us?
I do. I have a story.
Woohoo! Exciting.
Now, this story it sort of comes out of what I was sort of mentioning before with these recent weeks where I've been at my children's school where they've done this sort of residential program where they live in, and it's all about, building good young men and getting them in touch with their emotions and teaching them how to sew and cook, and, they go and
So
do
it's a crash course in home economics.
Well, a bit more than that. It's more about emotions and more about realising how, lucky they are and how they should view the world. So it's actually quite good.
They don't call it making gay or anything like that.
Not that I'm aware of, no. So we've
Some
had
classic gay pastimes there.
So we've had one child go in and one and come out, and one is currently in there at the moment. So on the day that the first child came out, my husband and I were it was like we'd been radicalized. We thought it was just the greatest thing ever, and we were like so happy that we had twins that we could get the opportunity to do it again, because we just thought it was such a brilliant program. And I still stand by that. But as a result of that, I think I was saying, oh my God, we've been radicalized. I think I've drunk from the Kool-Aid. And as a result of me saying that, and I thought, am I saying that
I know where we're
in the
going
correct
now.
You do know where we're going. Am I saying that in the correct context? When sometimes you say something and you think you know a bit about it, but you don't know exactly what it is.
We're going to Guyana.
Most days.
We are.
Yeah. Take a little trip down South America way.
So at that point, I went and started having a look. And
Clacky's face, Clacky's like, what?
So I went and Googled, obviously, taking a drink from
where does the
expression
and
come
you know from?
it's
not the right.
I know
it's a misquote.
It's a misquote.
Yep. Cool.
But where it kind of got interesting for me was I was aware of the name of this, we'll call it cult, crime, whatever.
It's a cult,
and
for sure.
I was aware of the saying that has come from it. I thought I knew where this occurred, and I was on the wrong bloody continent. And I think that is a bigger part of the interesting background to this crime. So the crime that it's more than a crime, it's bigger than that. The situation I'm referring to is Jonestown, which most people will have probably heard of. It was, obviously some decades ago. It was in the late 70s that this all sort of went down. But it's sort of something for me that I've never really looked into. And it's sort of, it's one of those things that if someone says it, I know kind of what they're talking about, enough to sort of get by. But I thought I wouldn't mind just having a little bit of a look into it so I could actually understand it. So I will call this episode, it's kind of like a Dummies guide to Jonestown. Okay. Because there's a lot of information in some of it.
That should suit me just fine.
Absolutely. And some of it, it's just too deep. So my sources are Rolling Stone magazine, Wikipedia,
Quality.
Daily Mail.
Rolling Stone is quality for this stuff.
It was actually.
That's what I reckon.
It's one really quite interesting article. And then I watched, what's it called when it's like a documentary? So part of it is factual, part of it is recreation.
A docu-series?
No, not even. Like when they're
where they recreate.
To be honest, and I started watching the beginning of this and I thought, oh God, I don't think I can do this. It started off really quite cheesy, but then they actually start to speak with real people who were involved, and then it gets much better. And it was called Jonestown Paradise Lost. So if you were going to go and have a look at it, stick with it. like when they're reenacting lots of it, it's sort of a bit like, oh, it feels like it's a Hallmark special. But it does, towards the back end when things really start to happen, I actually found it quite moving. And it was like, oh, wow, these people were on the ground at the time. And it brought to life what had occurred in a way that when I was doing the reading, I couldn't really kind of get my head around.
You can't picture
so,
it.
So it was actually really important. Having said that, the story itself is so big that I need to sort of use things. So I will be using Wikipedia quite a lot in terms of trying to take me through chronologically where this started, where it ended, the aftermath, etc. We need to start. Oh, actually, what I'll tell you first is what actually happens, because then we'll work back from there, because if anyone's going to Google it already, you already know. And what's important is that Jonestown was an agricultural project that the People's Temple, which, you know, you might want to call it a church, you might want to call it a cult, was an outpost that they had created in South America. And as Schmitty was saying, they had found a place in a country called Guyana, and it is sort of between Venezuela and sort of Brazil's underneath, and it's incredibly dense, you know, jungle type vegetation. It is not a particularly nice habitable place, and there was a reason why they were able to go there and get land there, etc. We'll come on to that. But where this is absolutely the key thing is, before September 11, this one incident was the biggest loss of life due to, you know, in one day in the history of America, not in terms of war. It's represented as the greatest number of American civilian casualties. There you go. So it's not necessarily as a result of, or the greatest number of civilian casualties from a single non-natural event. So not a cyclone, a hurricane, let's say volcano, they're not really cold in America, but earthquake, etc. And that's to say, it's unfathomable in many ways to think that so many people died as a result of that, but it was usurped by September 11. To go back, we need to go back to where this all started, and the People's Temple was a church that was formed by a gentleman called Jim Jones. It originated in Indianapolis in Indiana back in 1955, and although it was pitched as being Christian revival, what was really interesting was more that he saw it more as a Marxism, and what they had was a practice called I can't even say this word, apostolic socialism. And he had grown up with this sort of interest in Joseph
Apostolic.
That's it. Adolf Hitler and his heroes, and people who he frequently plays later, were Stalin and Lenin. So
just the good guys.
He was
good guys.
Hugely interested in communism, and he was very upset at that time that the Communist Party was being persecuted in the USA. And his fascination was actually, I think, more with that side of things than even the influence of religion. I think what he does is he brings these two together so that, as I'm reading it, more and more comes to do with the Marxist side of things, even in the religion. Like it plays a part of it, obviously, in terms of getting people involved. But where it was really interesting for me was that was the stuff that was quite clearly where his head was at most of the time, and the further he got into this. Whilst he's in Indiana, he starts to receive a little bit of criticism about, they call it integrationist views, which I think is this, religion and Marxism coming together. They leave Indianapolis and they head to Redwood Valley in California. And that was in 1965. So my understanding would be California at that time, especially, if you were looking for somewhere that felt a bit more free living and open to new sort of ideas, you probably would be leaving mid-America and heading towards that West Coast. So in the early 70s, this is the late 60s, they set up in Redwood. And then by the early 70s, they then have other temple branches in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, with the headquarters being in San Francisco. And at that time, they did have thousands of, again, it depends on where I'm reading it, but let's say followers. But Jim Jones, as the founder of the People's Temple, was absolutely the head of the movement, and it was Jim Jones that people were really, his teachings and his sort of persona that they were buying into. At that time, he even started to have a little bit of political influence. So when he got to San Francisco, he was pivotal in a local mayor being victorious, and I think it was because obviously he'd helped have him voted in. So things like that started to give him kudos, and, you know, people in places other than the church, they saw him as a genuine figure. It wasn't all, oh my God, this is all crazy. It was like, oh, this guy is actually doing things for good. He is helping people. And he was given a position as chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. He was seen to be a person who was trying to help public housing, people who needed help. It wasn't just all about him setting up something for himself in those early days. In fact, at one point, he even ended up...
So he was relatively altruistic.
I don't know if altruistic is the right word. When I go into the people that he had in there, which I'll go into next, you can kind of see why I could understand why people would look at him and think that he was doing things for a good reason. I can see that. So at one point, there was like a dinner given in his honour, and First Lady Rosalind Carter was there. So we've been through this with our clown killer, Gacy. Well, there was a presidential wife. You know, these people are moving in circles where there is influence, and, you know, when people are taking them quite seriously, because if there's something that they are seen to do which is good or adding to a community, you can see where that starts to give them a little bit more, not authenticity, but people sort of start to buy into it a little bit more.
I think, remember, was it with John Wayne Gacy where there was a photo of him? And so back in the 70s,
yes,
the idea of a photo that would be, I guess, a whole lot more influential than a photo nowadays, because if you were genuinely good friends with the president nowadays, you'd expect lots of photos. But one photo in the 70s would be huge, you would think.
Oh, look, in the 70s, if you had an autograph book and you had someone's signature in it, you'd think that was a big deal, right? That would
unverified
be
too.
An autograph book, thinking that was insane to have someone's autograph, let alone a photo.
Yeah.
Of course, it would mean a huge deal. So things are really quite good for the church. And where I find things to be quite interesting, and this is where one of my first errors was in terms of what I had in my mind about what I thought Jonestown was. This is going to come across as possibly sounding quite racist because I didn't really understand it. The photographs that I had seen of the people in Jonestown, a lot of the people were black. And so when I knew that Jonestown was an outpost...
When you mentioned earlier about the integration thing,
yes,
I wondered whether or not it's integration meaning...
Oh, yes,
it is absolutely It's the new frontier. It's black and white integration, not Marxism and religion.
You're quite right. You are right. I didn't know that. You're right.
As a quote from Hairspray, I'm all for integration. It's a new frontier.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so when I'd seen images and hadn't really been never concentrating on, I actually assumed that Jonestown was in Africa. And it absolutely isn't.
Oh, yes.
Do you know what I mean? So that was a leap that my mind had made, and I was wrong, because I've got a statistic somewhere about how many people of the people who were members were actually black, and a lot of them were black women. So where I think he really spoke to his demographic was he was certainly talking about integration. There were, blacks and whites. There were interracial relationships within the temple. And I think these people had found this sort of, well, he would call it a utopia, but they were accepted and they felt safe and they felt wanted. And I think he relied and sort of went into that quite heavily as to your value with us is real. We do really want you to be here. But I had totally missed that when I'd seen other images of it before. So when things start to be questioned, and there's a couple of media articles that start appearing in the early 70s, and they're really starting to question what's happening, and a couple of the temple members had defected, they start to look at another place that they might be able to have their utopia. So California is now not really going to float their boat. So they start looking at places perhaps in Canada or the Caribbean, looking at Barbados or Trinidad. And then it's during actually a trip to Brazil, I think that Jim Jones had taken earlier, that he'd been through Guyana. And it's at that point they start looking at Guyana as this agricultural temple kind of working, I don't know if you call it a town, I guess it is, but a society where they're going to build their own community. So they start looking into that and they start liaising with the government in Guyana, and they like it because it is also socialist. It had been a former English outpost, but with their dealings with the Guyanese, they also like the fact that within the government there were prominent black leaders in Guyana. So they thought that would also help them have a more peaceful place to live because they had such a large number of black people within their own community. So that seemed to be quite cohesive. However, another reason why they were looking at it was because they also thought that they could potentially have greater influence in Guyana, because it wasn't a rich country. It was small, it was poor. And if they could infiltrate the government as such, that they thought that would help them and their own cause. And Guyana was happy because it's on a border with Venezuela. And there was already like problems potentially with, military action there. So I think they were like, well, okay, well, we could do with a little bit of, US stability. So that would help. The irony of that being is that Jim Jones and his followers were totally against sort of the US government, the US capitalist system, because remember, they were totally, much more into communism, and they were supporters of the USSR at that time, Cuba, China, anywhere they thought was more sort of communist leaning was much more their bag. So before the church, the temple moved there en masse, there was a period of time where it actually had to be set up. So there was an initial sort of like 500 members that, were able to get visas very easily. And they were sent down there to build this sort of socialist paradise. And Jim Jones's reasoning and the way he sold it to his people was that they were starting to get increased media scrutiny, and he was very uncomfortable with that. And the media scrutiny was around people who had defected, and they were starting to say that there was abuse within the community, and that if they were out of line, that they were beaten, that things were sort of people were starting to do their usual thing for a cult. What do you know? Oh, all of a sudden they're taking people's social security payments. People are giving them their house. People are, it's all this thing of like, well, if you're in here and then you don't need it outside, then we'll take it. So it wasn't, I haven't read loads and loads about, oh my God, this was totally damning and that was totally damning. It was more a sense of control and how things sort of would progress from it being quite inane and you're all welcome, to little things. And then people actually go, oh, I'm happy to give you this. I'm happy to hand it all over. So whenever they would interview people, and they did often, they were just, oh no, we are so comfortable. And one of the things that I think is really an important thing to say is a lot of the people were really good people. They really bought into this dream of having a more altruistic society, somewhere where they could be with people who accepted them for who they were. They could, as you were talking about before, Schmitty, be integrated. It wasn't Black people being persecuted like they were potentially being in the cities in the US. Yes, they were part of a team, and they really felt that. And, there were so many children that were born off the temple that were mixed race. And I can look at it and see it and think, well, you know what, if your life had been not great, or you would feel comfort, and I could imagine that would be a great thing. But also for people who just really at that time wanted a different way of life and thought, you know what, we can build this paradise down in South America. Let's do it. So there were 500 of them that went down to build Jonestown, and Jonestown is super remote. So Georgetown is the capital of Guyana. Georgetown is hundreds of kilometres away from that. So more often than not, the way to get there was through, small plane, small flight to a nearby, but it wasn't even that close, airfield. So in terms of being able to get in there and get out, you kind of weren't. It was not accessible, and it was very deliberately very, very remote. And I've seen footage where they fly to the airfield, and it's just dense jungle below. It was basically built into a clearing. They'd cleared an area, and it was very basic roads and little huts, and there was a grand pavilion, which was sort of, the central meeting point. And they built this little society.
Sounds very admirable so far.
Well, part of it, for the people, I can see why it would be admirable. I don't necessarily think he ever was necessarily, but I think sometimes we're in a situation where we think, oh my God, how would you have fallen for that? Oh my God, how would you have fallen for that? All these different things. But when I truly looked at what some of these people perhaps got out of it and how they felt, certainly initially, I can kind of understand how they sort of ended up there. It was sort of this model community that they thought was just built by them for them. And I think that's where the difference lies, right? It didn't feel like it was just, it's not as obtuse as some other cults that I've sort of seen, where it becomes very obvious very, very fast. And I think it's because of that socialistic element to it that, you're either buying into that or you're not. So if you've bought into that element of it, that the bits that come thereafter can be a little bit bit grey.
And I think that also it wasn't religious based. It was much more political based.
Yeah, I think
So like when we think about Mother God and all
Yes.
the stuff we talked about in that episode, where we have, the aliens and I can't even remember now, the galactics and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
It's not far-fetched to say, why can't we go to some place and build a community that, as you say, is for us?
Yeah.
And if you're inviting a whole bunch of people who've been marginalised in the normal consumerist world that they live in, it's not really hard for people to say, actually, yes, I want that.
Yeah.
That is going to be a much better life for my children and myself than I live in a world where I'm frightened or I'm marginalised because of my skin colour.
Yeah.
If the story ended now, but for they all lived happily ever after, it would be such a beautiful story.
Nice.
It kind of would be.
What a perfect little...
Because, there's aspects of it that I can see and I can think, actually, it's quite nice. I mean, look, it was very rudimentary. It's not like they were going down there and thinking they were going to have, but they didn't want that. That's not what they're after, right? So that's kind of neither here nor there. At that point, Jim Jones is not down there. He has remained in San Francisco. So from 1973, that's when they acquired the land. And by 1977, so it took a number of years for them to actually build Jonestown. By 1977, Jones and several hundred more temple members moved to Jonestown en masse. And they do that at the time to escape the building pressure from the San Francisco media. They're really starting to get onto him and what is going on within the temple. There's more and more people, but not huge numbers, but vocal numbers of people who have defected and who are trying to put the spotlight on Jim Jones. So they're having, the local San Francisco Chronicle is constantly trying to interview and, successful somewhat. But I don't think anyone thinks that he's like a megalomaniac or anything like that. I just think they think, something's not quite right with this. It doesn't feel quite right, but it's not all bad yet. Yeah. So after the mass migration to Jonestown, the population peaks in 1978 at around 900-ish, which is quite a telling number. And what happens is once Jim Jones arrives there, it really does start to change. So I've seen people interviewed who were there before he was there when they were building, and they were so proud of the work and the effort that they put in and how they would come together. They were doing hard days, long days, labor. I think 6 a.m. till 6 p.m, and they'd be watching movies of an evening together communally, like in the pavilion. But when Jim Jones arrives, it all starts to change. And he starts to share a lot more sort of propaganda with them because he's got them as a captured audience really there. I mean, I'm sure a lot of them lived together when they were in the US, but now you've got a captive audience as such. So where they had been watching, entertaining movies that had been sent through from Georgetown, now they're being shown Soviet propaganda shorts and documentaries on America's social problems, again, showing them why they're better off where they are. We're anti-America, we're pro-Soviet Union. And things also started to fall into a little bit of disrepair in the sense that some of the resources that had been used on labour, keeping things moving and making the township work, he was using them for more sort of bureaucratic kind of things, and he started having them leave their work and they'd come to this sort of pavilion of a night and they'd have to do night studies. And the night lectures were all about this sort of switch from Jim Jones being, this is going to be our utopia, to their utopia being under threat. It was all about talking about revolution and enemies and creating alliances with Soviet countries. So they would have meetings in Georgetown with the embassies of, I can't believe this, that somewhere in Guyana would have that many embassies, but I've read that they had, a Russian embassy there, and they would have relationships with the Russian embassy. They were speaking with people in Cuba. It was sort of like they were setting up other options in case they needed support or to relocate, because they were always concerned that the Americans might come after them. Their primary way of communicating with the world, I mean, remember this is late 1970s, was through a shortwave radio. So they had a shortwave radio in Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, and they also had this quite beautiful building there, which was sort of like a headquarters, a central point for where people were flying in, and they would have a number of temple members living there who were very sort of high power, highly regarded by Jim Jones. And then they would use that as a base before they would go out to Jonestown. And then once they were there, it was, again, just a two-way radio, and they would just be transmitting between the two. And that was really the only outside and inside, any input output that there was within Jonestown, because you couldn't leave. There was jungle beyond. You couldn't walk down to a phone. Once you were there, you were really stuck. There was no way out or no one to communicate with. It was just these people who were like the really, really senior ones communicating with Jim Jones or his wife or anybody who was in the really top tier. They didn't have a prison there, and there was no formal capital punishment, but there were some other sort of methods of punishment that did start to come in, and one of them was being imprisoned in a 6 by 4 by 3 foot box, a plywood box.
I'd hope you were going to say they had a trial by wine world equivalent in Jonestown.
Well, the next one is, this is awful. They had another one that forced children to spend a night at the bottom of a well, sometimes upside down.
Oh, Jesus.
What? Upside down?
And even the Guyanese, they were where it was called the torture hole. And along with the beatings, it became a big subject of rumour within like the local community, not the actual Jonestown community.
Do we have one of them in Trial by Wine World?
We can now. There were members who did try and escape, and if they did, they were taken to an extended care unit where they were given a whole host of drugs, which don't mean anything to me, but I would imagine, things like Demerol, Valium, and they were just drugged. And armed guards would patrol the area day and night to enforce the rules. So it became heavier and heavier and more serious and more sinister. And in a relatively short period of time, I think it had existed without him there in a way that once his control arrived, and it also correlates with his own health and the demise of his own health. So it all starts to spiral. In the early days, there were still people trying to check on who was in Jonestown, were these people happy? And one of the reasons that there was a check was the US government was able to say that there was $65,000 a month in welfare payments that the US government was making to temple members that was then going to Jonestown. So through US government agencies, they were actually they were able to interview these people at one point before things got particularly bad to see if they were happy to be there. Was that money being taken against their will? And there were 75 people interviewed by the US Embassy, and not one of them said that they were forced to sign anything over or that they wanted to leave Jonestown at that point.
So can I just ask to make sure I understood that?
Yes.
The US government was paying welfare to people who were living in Jonestown, and they knew it. They knew that they were. So it wasn't like they had an address back in America. They were paying welfare to people living overseas.
No. For a year, it appears the commune was run primarily through social security checks received by members. And the US government was signed over to the temple. But they were all sure they were trying to find out if they were, they wanted to leave. But of course it's odd. Or do you mean the odd bit that they're living somewhere else? Because I can draw a comparison between the Poms who live in Spain.
Yeah, but I find it odd that they would pay welfare to people who are living outside of the country.
I guess they were
because they're no longer residents there. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if that still happens, because that just sounds like
there's a thing that I know that it's always in the Daily Mail. It's the same but different. Is with all of the English expats, usually retirees who did live, certainly before Brexit, Costa del Crime, Costa del Sol, Portugal, Spain, and they used to wonder what was going to happen with their payments when all of that sort of down the line. I don't know what the outcome was, but it's a similar situation where you're living somewhere else, but you're benefiting from the social security system of your original country. With Jim Jones in Jonestown, things start to escalate to a sort of a quite hectic place quite quickly. And a lot of that is said to come down to his declining physical and mental health. When he arrives, around the time he arrived in Jonestown, he's informed that he's got a possible lung infection, but he announces that he has, in fact, got lung cancer. And I do not know if he did or he didn't, but he was not well, and he tried to garner sympathy from the people. And the point was that he ended up being on a cocktail of really good drugs, really strong drugs, and he ends up abusing Valium, Quaaludes, stimulants, and barbiturates. So he just becomes this paranoid. I have to say, when I've seen the footage of him, there's something about him that reminds me of Elvis, and it's not that he's charismatic. It's not that at all. It might be just the era, the hair,
not
the
glasses.
Way he speaks. No, it's not like that.
Much.
It's kind of like, I don't find him endearing in any way, shape or form. I think he's awful. But by the point that I'm seeing him in a lot of this stuff is he's not so well, and he doesn't seem to be talking in a massively coherent way. And he starts to have sort of blindness and little mini strokes and convulsions. And then he's saying that he's suffering from insomnia. So you can just imagine he just starts to become this absolutely deluded, crazy, really paranoid shadow of the man that he ever was. And this is also coinciding with what's going on back in the US. And in the US, there is a sort of a movement by concerned relatives who want to come together and try and lobby the government to try and help them contact, to know that their families are right. Because once they've lost contact with them, they're gone. So some people they're defectors themselves. Other people were just family members of people who are in there, and they create this little group and they go to the US attorney and say, look, we really need you to help us with this. How can we get down there? How can we get to our relatives to make sure that they're happy and that they're safe? This also coincides with a custody dispute. And the custody dispute is kind of something that really starts to set everything into action. So in September of 1977, formal Temple members, Kim and Grace Stone, battled in a Georgetown court to produce an order for the temple to show cause why a final order should not be issued returning their 5-year-old son, John. A few days later, a second order was issued for John to be taken into protective custody by authorities. The fear of being held in contempt of the orders caused Jones to set up a false sniper attack upon himself, and he begins this series of what he calls the White Nights.
I must say, I didn't see that coming.
No.
That's not how I would deal with that.
No. And so what happens is, as he becomes more and more deluded and convinced that people are coming for him, he needs to show his followers that they're after him and that
he's
all
not
at
crazy.
risk. So what he does, and I've seen footage of this, is they had this thing, a series of them called the White Nights. And they would be in bed and all of a sudden an alarm would go off and they'd all be called and they'd be mustered in this grand pavilion. And then he would basically lecture at them for hours and hours and hours on end, usually throughout the night. So they was totally sleep deprived. He's just talking mumbo jumbo about all of these different enemies that they've got, everything, there's a big sort of, everyone's coming to get us. They're going to get us. They're going to get us. We need to have a solution if that's going to happen. What are our possible ways out of here? Do we need to go somewhere else? And there was one incident in particular that stemmed from this boy, Jonestown, because he'd been signed over. They'd made the parents sign when they left. So then he was like, oh no, he's our child. So that was where the conflict was. But then Jim Jones used that, and he had this white night, this one particular white night. It lasted for 6 days. So he had these people in a siege mentality. He had people all around the border. He had people in the temple with like machetes and that on the border of the perimeter of Jonestown waiting to be attacked. He kept saying, we're about to be attacked, we're about to be attacked, we're about to be attacked. And I actually think it was actually his wife in the end who went, enough, we've got to stop this. I don't know what happened, but then they all just went to bed. But they were
That'd wear thin, wouldn't it? Oh.
They were all so indoctrinated and tired and malnourished. They had been brainwashed by this point. There was nothing that they weren't normal people operating with normal, mental capacity like that. Everything had started to be taken away from them. And we all know what happens when you've got no sleep or that you're fearful, or it's just become total mania. After the 6-day siege, Jones no longer believed that the government could be trusted, the local government, the Guyanese government. So he directed temple members to write to over a dozen foreign governments inquiring about immigration policies relevant if they wanted to make a mass exodus by the temple to other countries. He wrote to the State Department of North Korea and Albania. In Georgetown, the capital, the People's Temple conducted meetings with the embassies of the Soviet Union, North Korea, Yugoslavia, and Cuba. I'm always surprised that they had that many embassies there. But he was trying to find potential places that they might settle if they needed to escape from Guyana. We see an escalation here in Jonestown. We're seeing an escalation in the US with the concerned relatives going to the government. And there is a particular journalist, Tim Reiterman, who was a journalist with the San Francisco Examiner, and he was following the story about the Stowen boy in the custody battle. And then he was also obviously interviewing these concerned relatives. So he, along with a local congressman called Leo Ryan, they start an investigation. They start to look at making a trip down to Jonestown. So Leo Ryan was the California's 11th Congressional District Representative, and he announced that he would visit Jonestown. He was actually friends with the father of Bob Houston, a Temple member in California, whose mutilated body was found near train tracks in California on October 5, 1976, 3 days after a taped telephone conversation with Houston's ex-wife in which leaving the temple was discussed. So it was becoming more and more serious, and the claims that were coming across his desk were clearly of interest to him, and the relatives were becoming obviously more and more concerned.
Wow.
So on November 14, 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan flew to Georgetown along with a delegation. The delegation include, I won't sort of go into everyone, but interestingly, there was his legal advisor, the deputy chief of mission for the U.S. Embassy to Guyana, Tim Reiterman, the San Francisco journalist, Greg Robinson, a photographer for the Examiner, Don Harris from the NBC, Bob Brown, NBC camera operator, Steve Sung, NBC audio technician. These people will all become super pivotal because they're the people who get to record what they see when they get to Jonestown, and Bob Click, an NBC producer, Charles Krause from the Washington Post, and Ron Javers from the San Francisco Chronicle. Then there were also the relatives from the Concerned Relatives representatives, Tim and Grace Stowen, Stephen Anthony Ketteris, Beverly Oliver, Jim Cobb, Sherwin Harris, and Carol Houston Boyd. Sherwin Harris I have seen interviewed, and Sherwin Harris, as a concerned relative, his daughter and ex-wife lived there, and his ex-wife was someone who was really senior. She was basically running the Georgetown sort of headquarters, this grand house, and she was as indoctrinated as you could be. So when he arrived, he was not necessarily trying to go to Jonestown. He just wanted to see his wife, and he was able to communicate with the wife. He stayed in a hotel in Georgetown. He called her and he said, I just want to be able to see Leanne. How can we go about that? And they agreed that he would be able to go to this house, this headquarter in Georgetown to see Leanne, because they were actually in the big city or the big town. Everybody else is trying to get into Jonestown, and Jim Jones is saying, no, you're not coming. You're not invited. You're not welcome. You're not to come here. So there's a little bit of, diplomacy that goes on in those early hours of those first couple of days that they're there. And they're trying to get Jim Jones to welcome or allow them to come to Jonestown. In the end, there's a plane that does leave and it flies to the nearby airfield. But because it can only accommodate so many, not everybody gets to go. And as I was saying before, Sherwin Harris, who I've seen, he was never going to go there because his daughter was in the town. So when they get to Jonestown, they are greeted finally in quite a celebratory way. Like, obviously they've all been told to, roll out the red carpet. The congressman's coming. He's totally against us, but let's show them what a utopian society can look like. So when they get there, they take them on a small tour, and there's like a kindergarten. The kindergarten is gorgeous, and it's the wife of, I think her name is Muslin Jones's. It's her baby. There have been 33 children that were born there. There's a nursery, and basically they take the kids from their parents, and then they grow up within the confines of the nursery, and they see their parents a little bit each evening before they're studying. And she shows this thing, they show these children reading. These children are really articulate. They're clever. They're beautiful. They look healthy. They look, well adapted. And they're showing them all the things that they want them to see. But Jim himself is already in a way that when Tim Reiterman had seen him in San Francisco and interviewed him on many occasions, he said his health had deteriorated so much, his speech was affected. He said he was already muttering to himself and saying things that were sort of nonsensical, or again, much more about everybody after him. It was all sort of over already kind of thing. They spend time with them. It's a somewhat positive experience, and then a couple of people try and defect. So they go up to, the journalists who are there, and, there's one where he like drops a little note in, and then the other people who are members find out that's happening.
Swanny, is it like that little girl who said, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything"?
It's a lot like that. It's a lot.
Remember
But
that?
oh God, they're so terrified though that they are scared for their lives because they know that if they try and make a move and they get caught, they'll probably be killed anyway. So things had escalated so much. They've all been terrorized by this point. And I just cannot imagine how terrifying it must have been for the journalists and whatever else to be there, because it starts off, it's such an issue to get in. It's so isolated. They're accompanied by these huge black men with guns or whatever, and they're taken the back of a truck, and there's this sort of tense environment where, yes, it's all smiles and this is all perfect, but behind you is someone with a gun or a machete or whatever else.
AK-47.
Yeah. It was
a little
not pleasant.
like a tripper deal tour to China.
Oh God, just
Cut that bit out, but yeah.
So then it gets to a point where they're like, okay, if anyone wants to leave, you need to tell us. We can look after you. And Jim Jones says, people, you're free to leave if you want to leave, to anyone who wants to, but I don't think many people will or anyone will. And a handful do. And I believe that there are about 15 in total. And Jim Jones is devastated, and he's saying to Congressman Ryan, it's all bad. And he's saying no. He said, look, I will go back, and what I'll say, it's mostly good. The people who are here, who want to be here, are here because they want to be here. And I can see why that would suit most of these people. The people that want to leave, you're allowing them to leave of their own free will, and that's really important, and I'll let that be known. That's really important. So he's trying to appease him. He's not saying, I'm going to go back and say it's all awesome. This is just the greatest thing. I'm not going to say it's woeful. I'm going to try and tell the truth. There are people that are genuinely happy to be here, and there are people who have had enough, or it's not the right place for them. And I will tell that story. Like, he comes across as a great politician in the sense that he's there for the people. He's trying to represent the families who need him to be there. He's there saying to people, if you need to leave, you want to leave, we're here to help you. The US government will look after you, you're US citizens. What's right for you? Do you know what I mean? And Jim, I can see what you're trying to do here, but you've got to make sure that people are looked after. So that's where he's at. So as they're leaving, it becomes really awful, where you can't quite tell who wants to genuinely leave and who is actually going to follow them to do a misdeed. Do you know what I mean? There's a guy who this guy's been interviewed, and he says, I don't think that guy's a defector. I don't think he's trying to genuinely leave. I think he's coming to do us harm. There's no way that man would ever go against Jim Jones. We've got to really watch him. I don't feel safe with him coming with us. And then the congressman's saying, right, are you sure you really want? Yes. And you can't tell anymore really who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's defecting, who's not. It becomes a real confusion of people who are desperate to leave, who are just like, get us out. The film crew, the journalists who are trying to get this incredible scoop, and Jim Jones kind of walking up and kissing them goodbye. It's so unsettling to watch. I cannot begin to tell you. It would be just absolutely terrifying. Why they're going to leave that? Someone's going to shoot you in the back. Someone's going to cut your head off with a machete. Who knows? But it just this heightened tension. So they head off to the Port Khartoum the airstrip where the aircraft is waiting. And remember, there's more people leaving than have arrived because they've got some defectors with them. So the people who want to leave, they need to make sure there's more than one aircraft. And then things start to go not so good. Yeah. So this is November 18, 1978. This is where it all starts to go terribly wrong.
It's pinning another drink.
Yeah. So as Congressman Leo Ryan and the media and the people who are going to defect leave Jonestown, Jim Jones thinks it's all over. There's nowhere else for us to go with this. They're going to come and get us. This is not going to work. So he instructs his own temple people to murder Congressman Leo Ryan. And what transpires is, so whilst...
Can I ask a question,
Yes.
Swanny? What's the evidence that he did that?
a lot of it's recorded. There's all this footage. And he's talking to his people. He knows what's happening. So what he does is he says to his temple heavies, and what he says to the community is, Congressman Ryan has been here. We have a gun in the plane. The pilot is going to shot. The plane is going to come down into the jungle. It doesn't say I'm going to. That's what he tells his congregation.
Oh.
That's what they hear. And he says, they're going to come for us. They're going to come for our children. So it's sort of two things at play. So whilst the group head off to the airfield, he's planning for them to be murdered. At the same time, he's going to his community and saying, right, there was only one way this could end. We can't let them go back to the US because they'll be coming for us. That plane's going to come down. And when they find out, the US, they're still going to come for us. We've got a bit of time, but they're going to come for our children first. As he's also doing that, he starts to then communicate with the woman that I told you who was in Georgetown. Her name was Sharon, who was the mother of Leanne, who's the dad had gone to visit. He was actually with his daughter having a visit when Sharon, the mother, got the two-way radio message or whatever on the speaker to say, it's time. And the reason they knew it was time and what time was because they had rehearsed this before as an entire community if they had to have a mass suicide. And in fact, there had been a practice one where they didn't know that it was a practice one. And then after 45 minutes when people didn't die, he said, I just had to test your loyalty. So they'd already been through this before. So when he put the message through to Sharon walks out to her daughter, Leanne, her 21-year-old daughter, who's sitting there having like a breakfast with her father, who's flown in from the US to see her, and says, I need to speak to you. So she takes her. She says to her daughter, this is the end. You need to go and say goodbye to your father. We need to kill ourselves. They go. They don't say that to him. The daughter kisses the father and says, Dad, you have to go, but and he said, well, can I see you tomorrow at 7 o'clock? Yes, I'll see you tomorrow. And then he says the ex-wife even came and kissed him on the cheek and said goodbye. And he said, I left on such a high. He said, I thought, oh my goodness, I've made some inroads here. I'm going to get to see Leanne again tomorrow. Even my ex-wife is happy that I've got this connection with my wife again. Things couldn't be better. So off he trots to the Pegasus Hotel in Georgetown, happy as Larry, not knowing what's going to transpire. In that
Happy
house,
as Larry they were.
at that time, Sharon had two smaller children with someone else in the temple. So she had two beautiful children, as well as Leanne, the oldest one, and she took all three of them and she slit the throats of the two younger children. And then her eldest daughter, and her, they were able to tell from forensics that they then helped slit each other's throat, the daughter and the mother. And there's one key piece of information that I've left out of all of this, which I've just remembered. Jim Jones had a son called Stephen, and Stephen Jones and a group of young men from the temple, they had gone to Georgetown with Jim Jones's kind of blessing it was to start with, and then he tried to bring them back to compete in a basketball tournament. So they were not at Jonestown. And so when all this happened, he was around going, oh my God, my dad has totally lost the plot, and he's still alive. He didn't kill himself, but he was the one who walked in and found the bodies of Sharon and her three children and how they had slit each other's throats. So that's what's happened in Georgetown. What happens when they get to the airstrip is it's just awful. They get them onto the runway. They're heading across to the planes, and there's a panic. Like, they're all trying to get out. Okay, who's going to fit on this plane? And someone's saying, this guy, I don't trust him. You haven't checked him for a weapon. I think he's got a gun. I think, so they're all trying to work out who's against them, who's with them, how the hell they're going to get out. They've got these two planes, and then a truck drives onto the runway as one of them's about to, and just starts to shoot at the people who have yet to board one plane and at the other plane. And Congressman Leo Ryan is murdered, along with, I'll go through a list of who the other people killed, but they were all injured. Very few of them were able to run into the jungle, but most of them were shot. And then one of them, Tim Reitman, who was a journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle, he survived. And he said that what he heard was he ran into the jungle, he fell down because he had been shot, but not critically. And he said after that, he said there was about 30 seconds of just shot. And what they did, they walked up and then shot everybody in the head. So that was what was happening at the airfield. So then they go back to Jonestown. They're like, right, he's dead. So then they announce, actually, Congressman's dead. We need to start. This is where the saying comes in. It was Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid. But this is when they say, rightio, Jim Jones says the children need to be given the cordial, whatever you want to call it, the drink first. And there are just photos and footage of like tables lined up with just vats of Flavor Aid. with just cyanide, and there was a whole host of different, like, I'll read out the list of things that they put into it. They prepared large metal tubs with grape Flavor Aid, but everyone calls it Kool-Aid. It's a bit like, Kleenex with tissues. It's a thing like that. That was obviously like a brand name. It was poisoned with, and this is where I'll get it all wrong, diphenhydramine, promethazine, chlorpromazine, chloroquine, chlorohydrate, diazepam, and cyanide. The concoction was prepared with the help of Jonestown's in-house doctor, Larry Shate, a Texan native and former methamphetamine addict who got sober with the help of Jones, who subsequently paid for his education to become a doctor. Shate had been researching the possible ways for a person to die in advance for the foreseen mass suicide. There's a 44-minute cassette tape known as the death tape, and it records part of the meeting Jones called inside the pavilion on that early evening of 18th of November 1978. When the assembly gathered, referring to Ryan's delegation's air travel back to Georgetown, Jones told the gathering, "One of those people on that plane is going to shoot the pilot. I know that. I didn't plan it, but I know it's going to happen. They're going to shoot that pilot and down comes the plane into the jungle, and we had better not have any of our children left when it's over because they'll parachute in here on us." Parroting Jones's prior statements that hostile forces would convert captured children to fascism, one temple member stated, "The ones that they take captured, they're going to just let them grow up and be dummies." On the tape, Jones urged temple members to commit revolutionary suicide. Such an act had been planned by the temple before, and according to Jonestown defectors, its theory was, you can go down in history saying you chose your own way to go, and it is your commitment to refuse capitalism and in support of socialism. One woman actually questioned it. Temple member Christine Miller argued that the temple should alternatively attempt an airlift to the Soviet Union. Jim McAlvain, a former therapist who had arrived in Jonestown only 2 days earlier, assisted Jones by arguing against Miller's resistance to suicide, stating, "Let's make it a beautiful day," and later citing possible reincarnation. After several exchanges in what Jones argued that a Soviet exodus would not be possible, along with reactions by other temple members hostile to Miller, she backed down. However, Miller may have ceased dissenting when Jones confirmed at one point that the congressman had been murdered after the airstrip shooters returned. When the Red Brigade, and the Red Brigade was the aggressive men that were on the truck that had both collected them, brought them to Jonestown and taken them and murdered them. Tim Carter, a Vietnam War veteran, recalled them having 1,000-yard stare of weary soldiers. After Jones confirmed that the congressman's dead, no dissent is heard on the death tape. So as I said, this is all recorded. By this point, armed guards had taken up positions around the pavilion area. Directly after this, Jones stated the Red Brigade's the only one that made any sense anyway, and that the Red Brigade showed them justice. There were some people that made speeches, and the decision of the community to commit suicide. And then, according to escaped temple member Odell Rhodes, the first to take the poison were Rouletta Paul and her 1-year-old infant. A syringe without a needle fitted was used to squirt poison into the infant's mouth, after which Paul squirted another syringe into her own mouth. Stanley Clayton also witnessed mothers with their babies first approach the tub containing the poison. Clayton said that Jones approached the people to encourage them to drink the poison, and that after adults saw the poison begin to take effect, they showed a reluctance to die. The poison caused death within 5 minutes for children, less for babies, and an estimated 20 to 30 minutes for the adults. After consuming the poison, according to Rhodes, people were then escorted away down a wooden alleyway, away from the pavilion. And in the photos, you just see people who are just lying down. It doesn't, most of them are face down. It was sort of unclear actually to some of them at first whether or not it was even a rehearsal. They didn't understand if it was another white night where they'd had to do like a dress rehearsal for the mass suicide. They didn't truly know. In response to reactions of seeing the poison take effect on others, Jones counselled, "Die with a degree of dignity. Lay down your life with dignity. Don't lay down with tears and agony," he said. "I tell you, I don't care how many screams you hear. I don't care how many anguished cries. Death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days of this life. If you knew what was ahead of you, you'd be glad to be stepping over tonight." Rhodes described a scene of both hysteria and confusion as parents watched their children die from the poison. He also stated that most present quietly waited for their turn to die, and that many of the assembled temple members walked around like they were in a trance. Survivor Tim Carter has suggested that, like a previous practice, the day's lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches may have been tainted with sedatives. The crowd was surrounded by armed guards, offering members the basic dilemmas of death by poison or death by a guard's hand. Cries and screams of children and adults were easily heard on the tape recording made as more temple members died. Eventually, the guards themselves were called in to die by poison. Jim Jones was found dead, lying next to his chair in the pavilion between two other bodies, his head cushioned by a pillow. His death was caused by a gunshot wound to his left temple that Guyanese chief medical examiner stated was consistent with being self-inflicted. The events at Jonestown constituted the greatest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the incidents of September 11, 2001. So the numbers are, there were 918 people in total. On the grounds of Jonestown, there were 909 people who died. At the airstrip, 5 people were murdered. There were obviously survivors there. And at the temple headquarters in Georgetown, there were 4. So there were the 3 children and Sharon's mother. So that's a total of 918 people died that day, which is just remarkable, isn't it? I cannot get my head around that. I really cannot believe it. What happens afterwards? You know, I can't imagine. There is footage that I've seen, and so much of it has to be blanked out these days. So now when they fly in, they show you the actual footage. There'll just be a sea of what was obviously bodies. So there's like a whole white paddle where you can't actually see what you'd be looking at it, you know, when a helicopter's flown over. It's just this open area with just hundreds of bodies all just laying down dead. I don't want to go into like all the different eyewitness accounts because I think I've probably told you enough, but there was one thing that I did find really quite interesting, or a couple of things, 2 things. Well, what happens to all these people? Where do they go? How did they sort of look after them? 914 of the 918 dead, including Jones himself, were collected by the United States military in Guyana, then transported by military cargo plane to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, a location that had been previously used for mass processing of the dead from the Tenerife airport disaster. The last shipment of bodies arrived early on the morning of November 27. The base's mortuary was tasked with fingerprinting, identifying and processing the bodies. The base's resources were overwhelmed and numerous individuals tasked with moving or identifying the bodies suffered PTSD. In many cases, responsibility for the cremation of the remains was distributed to the Dover area funeral home. So it was just this huge undertaking.
What an exercise.
Yeah.
God.
Now, who went to court? Where was the crime? Who served time? One man. Larry Layton, who had fired a gun at several people aboard the Cessna. So he was the person. Remember what I told you when they were leaving Georgetown? They couldn't tell who was a traitor or something, who really wanted to leave, who was actually doing Jim Jones's work, who was it going to be? Yeah. They couldn't tell. And one of the survivors kept saying, it's him. Like, check, he's got a gun or he's got a knife, he's got something. I just don't believe it. He's going to defect. I don't believe it. And that was Larry Layton. Larry Layton had fired a gun at several people aboard the Cessna and was initially found not guilty of attempted murder in a Guyanese court, employing the defence that he had been brainwashed. Acquittal in a Guyanese court did not free Layton, who was promptly deported back to the US and arrested by the US Marshals Service upon arrival in San Francisco. Layton could not be tried in the US for the attempted murders of these people's names were the family members Gosney, Bagby, Dale Parks, and the Cessna pilot on Guyanese soil. So they were the, family members plus the pilot, etc. But was instead tried under a federal statute against assassinating members of Congress and internationally protected people. So that was Congressman Ryan. He was convicted of conspiracy and of aiding and abetting the murder of Ryan and of the attempted murder of Dwyer. Paroled in 2002, he is the only person ever to have been held criminally responsible for the events of Jonestown.
Because they're all dead.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy? The event was covered heavily by the media, obviously. And now you've got to remember, this is not the media today. This is 1978. The most amazing thing was the fact that the CNN reporters did not survive, but the footage lived on and all the interviews that they had done inside. So you've got this before it happens, on the tarmac, like it's so well documented in that respect. And the journalist Tim Reitman survived. It just held all of the news space for probably months after that. It was labelled Cult of Death by both Time and Newsweek magazines. And in February of 1979, 98% of Americans polled said they'd heard of the tragedy. George Gallup said that few events, in fact, in the entire history of the Gallup poll, have ever known such a high percentage of the US public being aware of it.
That's that. Don't drink the Kool-Aid.
I know. It is just incredible. And to think that it just dumbfounds me that many people would do that. But the people who seemed to be the most supportive were the people who had defected, and they loved those people that killed themselves. They were their family. They were like, it wasn't right for me. I had to get out. But some of these people are the most incredible people I've ever met. I lost my family in that one day. All these people that I loved, although I wanted to leave.
Survivor guilt.
Yeah. And of course, there were people who had left their children were murdered. Their lives have been a whole host of problems. And there's so much more to it than what I've said. And I just kind of wanted to do a Dummies version, a little bit of who Jim Jones was, how he attracted this particular demographic of people. That is what I find really interesting. There were 999 people at that point. 638 were female, 361 were male. So many more women. But of the 638, 460 of those women were black, 138 white, and 27 mixed. So that's, it's heavily black people who have found this, what they thought was a peaceful way of living, coexisting and being integrated. And I really think that's quite admirable. I think I can understand why you'd be buying into that. And when someone's saying, look at all the problems they're having socially back in the US, you don't want to be, in a city, you'll be murdered. There's drugs, there's crime, there's whatever else. It's like, this might not be always ideal, but it's still better than that. I can totally get behind that. And I certainly understand when these survivors talk about how wonderful these people they were in there with. They're not saying they were idiots or that they were like, by the time this all happened, we were totally malnourished. We had had insomnia. We'd been indoctrinated with all this stuff that we were about to be murdered by other forces. We might have to move. I can really get my head around that, actually. I think it's just terrifying. And that is Jonestown for Dummies. Thoughts?
Goodness.
Oh, so many thoughts. Trying to collect them up off the ground into some kind of normality. God.
I did see a documentary about it 8 years and years ago, or some time ago, and the thing that stood out for me was, and it's in the death tape as well, Christine Miller.
Yes.
And she's like notably one of the only people who tries to talk him out of killing everyone.
Every day here on earth is better than a day dead. That kind of thing is what she's saying. Surely, we're better off here doing what we can do than not.
But her relationship with him also was interesting. She seemed to be, and I think he says it in there, he says, you're an agitator, and I like that. But I think she always was an agitator, and she sort of stood up to him along the way. And I think, if I'm remembering it rightly in that documentary, people talked about she kind of got away with shit that other people didn't get away with. He kind of respected her.
There's a whole host of stuff that I haven't gone into because I just couldn't find it. And it would have been much about the sexual relationships with people.
Sort of person who, I don't think they were in a sexual relationship. I think she just seemed to be someone who was like, hang on, dude. And
good on her.
Yeah.
Because I didn't really go into the dynamics of different relationships with people, even the relationship with his wife and stuff. I sort of saw things and touched on it, but I think that could be an entirely separate episode.
But there's a whole other theory about what happened at Jonestown.
Does it involve the CIA?
It certainly does, yes.
Yes.
In that the CIA had infiltrated Jonestown earlier.
Yeah.
Because there is a document that the CIA actually radioed in at like 3:08 or something a.m.
Right.
Before anyone else actually got there.
Right.
So the CIA were on the scene before anyone else.
Yep.
And actually made a radio, and it was documented. It was on the CIA radio frequency. So there was a suggestion that some of the people in Jonestown may have been CIA operatives, that the murdering of Congressman Leo Ryan was because he was anti-CIA. Apparently, like a huge enemy of the CIA kind of thing. Thought it was a waste of money and a terrible situation. and that they saw it as sort of an opportunity to knock off Jim Jones, knock off this, because you're right in terms of that terror of communism.
Yes,
that was the kind of national psyche at the time, and particularly in the security forces. And it's really interesting because the case I've been researching for my next go is really related to this. It's not about Jonestown, but it's got legs into this story. So I'm not going to mention the thing that connects the two, because it'll give away what I'm going to talk about next time. But yes, really, it's interesting. And I suppose I wouldn't normally pay attention to that. So I'd say that as a conspiracy theory. But seriously, having just researched my story, I'm like, maybe there is something in it. Not to say necessarily that the CIA went into Jonestown, because there's she's not a survivor of Jonestown. Right. She didn't go to Guyana, but she is an ex-Temple member.
Yes.
And she has written a book and asserts this theory around, it's Laurie Efrin Kahalis, something like that.
Yeah.
And has, sort of asserted this theory that that it was basically a setup. And see, even that's why I asked you earlier about the evidence about how do we know Jim Jones actually ordered it.
Oh, right. I see what you're saying.
Because that tape is quite doctored as well. The death tape, if you listen to it, rather than just read transcripts of it, have clear moments where it's been edited. That's not to say, however, that people didn't just... I know. But that's not to say that they didn't just cut out the 10 minutes of silence while people were thinking about, are we going to get murdered or, kill ourselves?
Yeah.
The other thing that's really interesting, and these are just sort of factoids that you can take or leave, is that injection in the back of the shoulders. So everyone who was injected were injected in an identical position between their shoulder blades.
Is that right? I didn't read that.
Yeah.
What does that suggest?
Because I don't really know what it means, but there was a suggestion that, because some people were shot too, they didn't all just take poison.
Yeah.
My understanding of it was people
who tried to run away. I think maybe someone tried to get away with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last thing that's interesting is that Jim Jones was right-handed, and the gunshot wound was to his left temple.
Yeah.
Which is pretty hard to do when you're right-handed. Yeah. So probably someone else shot him.
Yeah.
Not to say
unless he's doing it.
I thought I'd read, because it's funny that you should say, because I thought I'd read that he had a gunshot wound that wasn't suggested. That was, but then when I read the next time, it was that it was through suicide, or self-inflicted.
Yeah.
And I thought, the last time I read that, I thought I saw it or still talked about it. I got the impression that it was done on his behalf. He didn't even. Oh no, it was his own son who said it. He didn't even do it himself. He even had someone do that for him. That's
someone said. Is it Annie Moore or someone who was?
So then I was like, oh, did he or didn't he?
Someone suggested she might have done it. Who knows, right? Unless you actually had CCTV watching the whole thing, you don't know who did what, because then someone else refuted the idea that Annie Moore could have done it, because she was off, killing herself or drinking the Flavorade. Anyway, yes, regardless of what really went down, what went down, full stop. It's a horrendous waste of human life. Especially for a group of people who set out to create this utopian society. And to all intents and purposes, minus the increasing illness and insanity of their leader, could have got there, could have done it. And so it's just incredibly tragic.
It really is. I've got this quote here that was from the Rolling Stones article. This woman's Jean Clay, she said, the people were incredible. She'd worked on a Tadpole newspaper. She actually had left. But she said these people were capable of committing themselves to something outside of self-interest. And she said the thing with all of us was we were doing the right thing, but they ended up in the wrong place with the wrong leader. Yeah. They weren't bad people.
Take him out of it. And, and if they'd had someone who wasn't him and didn't go off the boil and didn't decide the best way to deal with everything is to practice killing ourselves or to kill ourselves, they could have made a good go of it.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to go down the sentencing route because everyone's dead. It's sort of like it all happened. I mean, even Jim Jones, it's not like he walked out of that and was like, Jesus, I didn't tell him to do that. No. I'm innocent. And whether he was shot himself or someone shot him, he kind of went down with the ship, put it that way.
Yeah.
It's a difficult one because, normally you want to have someone to blame. You can see the failings of various things. But they were talking about 1,200 people at one point were in that temple. It's not a small group of people who
not at all.
Went down this path. And as you said, they were good people. So no one wants to punish the people.
And what I find really hard to get my head around is someone who was really ahead of their time, or certainly within the confines of, the what would have been starting in the 50s, going to the 60s, before we even get to the 70s, about being integrated with the blacks and the whites and really celebrating that and having mixed religion. There weren't many people doing that. There's so many aspects of equality and both racial and social that I think, how did it go from something that is actually really wonderful to something evil? It just hidden.
It's really hard to get your head around, because I think, that whole, I could see why it would have started out with the best intentions, that it's such a good thing to do in many ways. And I haven't seen anything through the story that's intimated that he's had this plan in place, or, he's been looking for a way to make this happen. Anything to say that was his end goal, was to get a whole lot of people to commit suicide. What I'm wondering is, we did a story, a long time ago now, and one of the things that was put up as part of the defense was the side effects of the medication. And if he's on a cocktail of drugs, could it be that it made him completely delusional, and that's kind of what did it? And if we were, I wonder if anyone's done any research into that combination of drugs that he was on, and what that would then do for your mental health, kind of, and the way you perceive reality in the world. Because it just sounds nonsensical. I can't really get from the start to the end of the story. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't believe it happened, right? It doesn't make any sense. I can't see a motivation. I can't see. It doesn't even sound like he was setting it up because he was egotistical. It sounds almost like he did have an admirable plan that
initially, I think,
went toxic. But I don't know what it is that changed.
I don't know where the sort of seed of that is. I would think it would be California when they were there. That's where they started to have some complaints, and people sort of not happy. But
that doesn't get you to murder and, mass suicide, and does it? I don't know. Gosh,
no.
It doesn't even sound like an. And I don't know. Maybe I misunderstood, but
it's a bit like Waco, though.
Well, kind of, but he was a bit. Oh, I guess I see some.
He was David Koresh
differences. Well, I think he was a much more. It was very obvious in that he was very egotistical. I'm not sure that you could say that about Jim Jones, but it sounds like he was actually being fairly admirable, not grooming people, not having this hierarchy of, if you
but at the end, this, when he makes them practice killing themselves, and when he
but that's when that's what I'm saying about the cocktail of drugs. Is that what changed?
It sounds like it does sound like he spirals into some kind of mental health or delusion or something. Yeah. But he doesn't ever say, or does he, Carla? Does he? I know they called him father.
Yes,
the followers. Yeah. So he probably did have.
Yeah, right. So then.
Godliness on some level, yeah.
There's enough crazy stuff if you sort of.
There's no evidence to suggest that he did have a massive ego. That Christine Miller I was talking about before, there's an incident at some point in her relationship with him where she's disagreeing with him and he holds a gun to her head and he says, I can just shoot you and no one will know. And
jeepers.
Yeah,
and she says something like, yeah, go ahead, whatever. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. She says something like, go ahead, but you'll shoot me, but you'll respect me. And this escalates. And he's shouting at her, he's holding a gun, and she's like, go ahead and shoot me, but you will respect me.
Jesus.
And he backed down. So there's something not right with him, well before this happens. That's why I'm saying she stuck in my mind as a really significant person in all of this because of her defiance of him right to the end and trying to advocate for the kids and stuff.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't see that. I did see a little bit of footage with her questioning him.
The other thing that struck me as interesting is the similarities between what a leader can do for a people, albeit it's only 900. If you take that to a national scale and look at what leaders can do to the culture of a country, for instance.
That's terrifying.
When you're not being brainwashed. just for us people in everyday life, you can understand why conspiracy theorists come around.
There's plenty of people who will say that we are brainwashed. We are the sheeple, remember?
Yes.
You can understand all of that during COVID, all of the conspiracy theories, if you
but it's still
know a little bit about
now.
This stuff. 100%, I agree. Even worse, I reckon, now since COVID. It's
because I think it's so awful. I don't really have a sentence.
No, I don't think it needs to.
Maybe just a public service announcement that says, if you want to be a Marxist or a socialist, or that's okay, but don't move to a country in the middle of the jungle.
You know, with a mad
be
leader.
so remote and cut off that when things go bad, they go real bad.
If replicating Jonestown is on your bucket list, take it off right now.
Absolutely.
No, it's a hard no.
That's another one that I've thought about doing, but it seems so massive. So well done.
Yeah, well done.
And
I did it very sort of, in a selfish way, because I was like, I don't really know what that saying means. Yeah. And then I thought, once I started looking into it, I went, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. I thought it was in Africa.
All right. Well, good one, Swanny. And as we say every week, miss you already.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, 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 ciao.
Thanks for listening to Trial by Wine. You can contact us at trialbywine@gmail.com. Please rate, review and subscribe to Trial by Wine on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support us, you can become a patron at www.patreon.com, Trial by Wine, or visit our website www.trialbywine.com to donate to us. Your support will help us cover many more cases and apply wacky sentences. We really appreciate you listening and hope you tell everyone about us. Our cover art is by John Christo and music is by Beauchamp from pixabay.com.